The Admiral's hand shot out and grabbed her sleeve before she could step back. The fabric tore with a sound that cut through every voice in the room. Someone gasped. No one moved. Admiral Richard Caldwell stared at what the torn cloth had revealed, a tattoo black and precise coiled around her forearm, like something that had always been there waiting to be seen. His face went still in a way that scared the people watching more than his anger ever had. He had just made the worst mistake of his career, and he didn't even know it yet. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel right now and follow along until the very end. We release stories like this every week. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The USS Resolute had been at sea for 11 days when everything started going wrong at once. It began small, the way the most dangerous things always do. A flicker in the tactical display at 0437. A data packet that arrived 3 seconds late, then 6, then didn't arrive at all. A communication relay that should have been redundant, but wasn't feeding corrupted position data to 3 separate systems simultaneously. By 0500, the operations center was running on backup protocols. By 0515, 2 of those backups had failed as well. Commander Elena Voss had been awake since 0300. She hadn't been called. No alarm had gone off in her quarters. No urgent message from the watch officer had reached her door. She had simply been sitting at her secondary terminal in the lower intelligence deck, reviewing pattern data from the previous 72 hours when she noticed the first anomaly. A variance so small that any automated filter would have dismissed it as background noise. She didn't dismiss it. She wrote it down, cross-referenced it against 2 archived incident reports from separate theaters, and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes thinking about what it meant. Then she put on her uniform jacket, made herself a cup of coffee from the station's small dispenser, and walked upstairs to the operations center to wait. She was there when the cascade began. She was already seated at a secondary console when the duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Harris, first started raising his voice. She was already pulling raw traffic data when the backup relay failed the second time. And she was already 3 steps into her diagnostic when Admiral Richard Caldwell walked through the operational door at 0521, buttoning his collar with the particular stiffness of a man who had been woken too early and did not consider that acceptable. Caldwell was 61 years old, thick through the shoulders, and carried himself with the particular weight of a man who had spent 37 years collecting the deference of others. He had commanded 2 carrier strike groups, survived 2 congressional hearings, and was known throughout the Pacific Fleet for a management philosophy that could be summarized very simply. Loudness was leadership, certainty was competence, and hesitation was the first symptom of a problem that needed to be removed. He walked into the operations center, looked at the failing displays, and looked at the people gathered around them. His eyes moved quickly, categorizing. Senior staff present and visibly stressed, which was appropriate. Junior officers too, still too wide-eyed, needed to be doing something. And then his gaze landed on Elena Voss, sitting slightly apart from the main cluster of personnel at a secondary terminal, her coffee cup beside her keyboard, her expression utterly calm. He stared at her for a moment. She didn't look up. "Someone want to tell me why we're losing primary telemetry on a clear sky morning," Caldwell said. His voice filled the room the way it always did, not quite a shout, but close enough to produce the same physiological response in everyone who heard it. Lieutenant Commander Harris stepped forward. "Admiral, we have a cascading failure across sectors 4 through 9. Primary relay is down, secondary relay compromised, and we're getting corrupted positioning data across." "I can see what it says on the board, Harris. I'm asking why." "We're working on isolating the source, sir." "Then work faster." Caldwell moved deeper into the center scanning displays. "What's the status of the defensive perimeter?" "Running on tertiary backup, sir. Functional, but reduced sensitivity." "How reduced?" "Approximately 40% degradation in the outer detection range." That landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. 40%. On an open ocean. With a carrier group. Every person in that room understood exactly what it meant, even the ones who were pretending they didn't. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "How long to restore?" "Unknown, sir. The failure pattern it's unusual. We haven't seen this configuration before. It was at this exact moment that Elena spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand up or turn around. She simply said, still looking at her terminal. The failure pattern isn't new. It matches a Category 3 infrastructure disruption from the Coronado incident in October of last year, and a partial cascade documented in the Baltic Theater 8 months before that. Different systems, same underlying mechanism. The room went a different kind of quiet. Caldwell turned to look at her. Elena still hadn't turned around. "Commander," he said. His voice carried something she recognized immediately, the particular edge men like him got when a junior officer had said something accurate that they hadn't said first. "Do you have something to add to this briefing?" "I have several things to add," she said. "I've been reviewing the data since approximately 0310 this morning. The failure originated in Sector 6, not Sector 4. The Sector 4 readings are a consequence, not a cause. If the diagnostic team continues focusing on Sector 4, they will stabilize those readings temporarily, and the underlying problem will migrate to Sector 11. We have approximately 37 minutes before that happens." Silence. Then Harris said carefully, "How certain are you about that timeline?" "Certain enough that I came upstairs instead of going back to sleep," Elena said, and she said it without any particular inflection, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd been aggressive about it. Caldwell took 2 steps toward her. "Commander, what is your name and assignment?" She turned then. "Commander Elena Voss, sir. Naval Intelligence Tactical Analysis Division. I've been assigned to this vessel for 6 months." He looked at her the way he looked at a lot of things quickly and dismissively, making a judgment before the full picture had assembled itself. She was 29. She looked 26. She had the kind of face that people called serious in a way that usually meant they weren't sure what to do with her, and the kind of posture that came from years of being the calmest person in rooms that were not calm. Her uniform was immaculate. Her collar was straight. Her coffee cup was the only object on the console that wasn't standard issue. "You've been assigned to this vessel for 6 months, he repeated. "Yes, sir." "And in 6 months you've apparently developed the ability to predict cascade failure timelines with 37-minute precision." "The prediction isn't psychic, sir. It's pattern analysis. The same signature appeared twice in the last 14 months. I documented both instances in a systems vulnerability report I submitted in March." Something flickered behind his eyes. It was gone before she could name it. "I'm not aware of that report." "I can pull it up for you." "That won't be necessary right now." He turned back to the room. "Harris, get the diagnostic team refocused on Sector 6. Run it against the Coronado data." He didn't acknowledge Elena again. He moved on to the next briefing point, as though she had offered a minor administrative detail and not in fact correctly identified the source of a crisis that no one else in the room had found. Elena turned back to her terminal and kept working. She did not feel the need to be thanked. Gratitude was not the point. The point was the 37-minute window, and 17 of those minutes had already elapsed. What she did feel, and what she acknowledged to herself, with the honest precision she applied to everything, was a familiar weight. The particular tiredness that came not from lack of sleep, but from the cumulative experience of being heard second. Of watching the room absorb what you had said, hesitate, and then reconfigure the information as though it had originated from the man standing closest to the authority position. She knew the feeling well. She had known it since she was a 22-year-old analyst sitting in rooms full of people twice her age, watching them rotate around her conclusions without ever quite landing on her name. She had learned over time that the feeling had a use. It kept her focused. It kept her from the trap of needing the room to respond correctly, which was a trap that consumed enormous energy and produced results approximately never. What she needed was the data, the window, and access to the system. The rest was noise. She had 12 minutes left. She worked faster. The diagnostic team reached Sector 6 at the 11-minute mark. At 8 minutes, they confirmed her analysis. At 5 minutes, the failure signature was isolated, and the migration to Sector 11 had been interrupted. At 3 minutes, primary relay restoration was initiated. At 39 minutes after Elena had predicted it, give or take 90 seconds, full telemetry was restored, and the operations center exhaled as a single organism. There was a brief spontaneous applause from two of the junior officers. Harris shut it down with a look, but he was almost smiling when he did it. Caldwell received the restoration report, nodded, and said, "Good work. Let's get a full incident report filed by 1400. He looked at Harris. "I want to know how this failure was allowed to develop without earlier warning." "Certes," Harris said carefully. "Commander Voss submitted a systems vulnerability assessment in March that may be relevant." A beat. "I said I want the incident report by 1400, Caldwell said. "Have someone pull the March assessment and include it in the file." He looked at the room generally. "Resume normal operations." He was almost through the door before he stopped and turned. Elena was back at her terminal. Her coffee had gone cold. She was already pulling the next data set. "Commander Voss," Caldwell said. She looked up. "Sir." He seemed to search for something to say, and what he landed on was this: "Try to look a little less relaxed next time. People are going to wonder whose side you're on." The room heard it. Several people found interesting things to look at that were not Elena's face. Elena held his gaze for exactly the right number of seconds. "Understood, sir," she said. He left. She turned back to her terminal. But Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who had been assigned to the Resolute for 8 months, and considered himself a reasonably good reader of rooms, watched her hands on the keyboard for a moment after the Admiral was gone. They were perfectly steady. That was the part that stayed with him. Not what she'd said, not the accuracy of her prediction, not even the Admiral's parting comment. It was that her hands never once shook. He filed that away and didn't say anything. The next 72 hours were quiet in the operational sense. The systems held. The fleet maintained position. Reports were filed, assessments were reviewed, and the USS Resolute settled back into the rhythms of an at-sea command that had survived a close call and was actively choosing not to discuss how close. Elena spent those 72 hours doing what she always did. She reviewed data. She cross-referenced anomalies. She submitted 2 follow-up technical notes through official channels, both of which received automated receipt confirmations and no subsequent responses. She ate in the junior officer's mess, which was not technically where she was ranked to eat, but which she preferred because it was quieter and the coffee was marginally better. She slept in 4-hour intervals. She ran 3 miles every morning on the treadmill at 5 a.m. before the gym got busy, because she did not enjoy being watched. On the morning of the 4th day, she was in the corridor outside the primary intelligence suite when she heard her name. Voss. It was Captain James Whitaker, the vessel's executive officer. Whitaker was 53, thin, with the careful eyes of a man who had learned long ago that the most useful thing you could do in almost any situation was listen rather than respond. He had been at sea for 28 years. He was one of 3 senior officers aboard the Resolute, whom Elena genuinely respected, which she considered a reasonable ratio. "Captain," she said. He fell into step beside her. "You heard the Admiral's comment," he said. "It was not a question." "I did." "What did you do with it?" She considered this. "Filed it," she said. "In the same category I file most things that aren't operationally useful." Whitaker made a short sound that might have been a laugh. "He does that," he said. "The comment about whose side you're on, it's his tell. It means you made him uncomfortable, and he doesn't know what to do with that yet." "I wasn't trying to make him uncomfortable." "I know. That's what made him uncomfortable." He paused, and then said more quietly, "That vulnerability report you submitted in March. I read it." She waited. "It was good work," he said. "The routing on the March report. Do you know where it went after it left your desk?" "It should have gone to the Systems Vulnerability Review Committee and the flag-level intelligence briefing. It went to a flag-level inbox where it was processed as a routine submission and queued for the quarterly review cycle." She was quiet for a moment. "That review cycle completes in September." "Yes." "That would have been 6 months after the vulnerability I identified was actively exploitable." "Yes," Whitaker said again. "I know." He stopped walking. She stopped too. "I'm pulling the full routing history on your submission and several others from the past 18 months. I want you to be aware of that. Why are you telling me? He looked at her directly. Because if this goes where I think it's going, things are going to get complicated. And I want someone with a clear head to know that at least one other person on this ship has been paying attention. He paused. How are you holding up? It was a question people asked, and usually didn't mean. She looked at him and understood that he did mean it. I'm fine, she said. I'm always better when I have a problem to work on. And right now, she said, I'm looking at data that suggests the cascade failure 4 days ago was not a random malfunction. Whitaker went very still. I haven't written the assessment yet, she said. I don't have enough to be certain, but the failure signature was too specific. The timing the migration path the way it interacted with our particular backup architecture, it would require detailed knowledge of our system design to replicate accidentally. You're saying it wasn't accidental. I'm saying the probability of an accidental failure matching this specific signature is low enough to treat it as non-accidental until I have data that convinces me otherwise. The silence between them had weight. How long do you need? Whitaker asked. 48 hours? Maybe less. He nodded once. File it through the standard channel when you're ready. Copy me directly. He started walking again. And Voss. Sir, don't be alone with the data on this. Document everything as you go. Every finding, every timestamp, every channel you use to submit. He paused once more, and the thing he didn't say was perfectly audible. Just in case. She understood. She went back to her terminal. The data was waiting for her like it always was, patient and exact, and indifferent to what anyone in the room thought about the person reading it. She settled into her chair, pulled up the Cascade records, and began moving backward through the timeline looking for the thread. She found the first one at 1400 that afternoon. By midnight, she had 3. By the following morning, she had 7, and she was no longer just tired. She was something that felt, if she examined it carefully, like afraid. Not of the data itself, but of what the data meant, and what it meant for the people around her who had no idea it was there. She sat with that feeling for a moment. She acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged all things that were real without drama and without dismissal. Then she picked up her pen, opened a fresh log entry, and began to document. Whatever was happening to the USS Resolute, it had started long before the Cascade failure. And someone had hoped they would never find out. The next morning, Admiral Caldwell came to her, not to talk, not to collaborate. He came because the incident report had crossed his desk, and the incident report referenced her March submission. And the March submission referenced 2 prior analyses she had filed in January and February, and the chain of documentation had apparently produced in him the same effect it produced in most people who encountered it without expecting to a slow building discomfort that had nowhere comfortable to land. He found her in the intelligence suite at 800. She was alone. The room had the particular quiet of early working hours, just the sound of processing equipment and the distant movement of the ship. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. Commander Voss, he said, I've been reviewing your submission history. Yes, sir. You've filed 7 separate vulnerability assessments in the past year. 8, she said. The last one went out 2 days ago. Something shifted in his face. 8 assessments. Yes, sir. And in your professional opinion, he said. And the particular way he said professional opinion told her everything about what was coming. Were these assessments reviewed and appropriately acted upon? They were received, she said. I have automated confirmations for all 8. Whether they were reviewed I can't say for certain because I don't have visibility into the review process after submission. But you have an opinion. I always have an opinion, sir. I try to make sure my opinions are data-driven before I express them. And your data-driven opinion about your own submissions. She met his eyes. My data-driven opinion is that the Cascade failure 4 days ago was predictable, and that if the vulnerability I identified in March had been escalated through the appropriate review process rather than queued for a September quarterly review, we would have had an opportunity to address it before it was actively exploited. He heard the word exploited. She watched him hear it. You're suggesting this was deliberate, he said. I'm suggesting the failure signature is inconsistent with random malfunction and consistent with deliberate manipulation. I'm not in a position yet to say by whom or through what mechanism. The silence stretched. That is a very serious accusation, Commander. It's not an accusation, sir. It's an analytical assessment. I made the same distinction in the written report, if you'd like to review my exact language. He took 2 steps into the room. The dynamic changed slightly when he did that. The way dynamics always shifted when senior officers moved deeper into a space a junior officer occupied alone. She didn't move. She didn't shift in her chair or look away. She held the same posture she always held, attentive and still and completely unintimidated, and she watched him process that. You're very confident, he said. I'm accurate, she said. I try not to confuse the two. He stared at her. There was something happening in his expression that she recognized, a frustration that didn't have a clean outlet because she wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't being insubordinate. She wasn't raising her voice or challenging his authority. She was sitting at her terminal presenting documented analytical conclusions in professional language, and every word she had said was defensible. The frustration needed somewhere to go. You know what I see when I look at you, he said. She waited. I see someone who's very good at paperwork. Someone who submits reports and files analyses and documents everything to a fare thee well and never actually has to be in the room when things go sideways. You can always point to the report you filed. You can always say you warned them. Very tidy, very safe. She held his gaze. With respect, sir, I was in the room when things went sideways. I was there before you arrived. Writing notes. Solving the problem, she said. You'll find documentation of that as well if you review the timeline of the restoration. His jaw tightened. I know what the timeline says. Then you know I identified the source, predicted the migration window, and the restoration followed the course of action I recommended. Recommended to Harris, he said. Not to me, too. She understood what he was saying. It sat in the room between them, not quite accusation and not quite honest, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. I provided the analysis to the senior officer present in the room, sir, she said. At the time, that was Lieutenant Commander Harris. And when I walked in, you were present when I summarized the analysis for the room. I don't recall being asked to repeat it directly to you at that point. It was exactly accurate. It was also, she knew exactly the kind of response that men like Caldwell heard as something other than an answer. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her with the particular look of someone assembling a version of events they preferred over the version that was documented. Know your place, Commander, he said. His voice was flat and cold and completely controlled. Your job is to support the tactical decision-making of your commanding officers, not to run competing analyses that undermine their authority, not to make senior officers look like they missed something you caught. Your job is to support. Understood? The room was very quiet. Understood, sir, she said. He turned to go, and then he stopped, because he had reached for the doorframe to push himself off, and his hand came into contact not with the frame, but with her sleeve, which was closer to the door than he'd accounted for. He felt the catch of fabric and pulled, and the motion was slightly too sharp, and the uniform sleeve, which was old enough that the stitching at the cuff had been repaired twice, gave way. The sound of fabric tearing was small. It shouldn't have mattered. He looked down at what his hand had done. The sleeve had pulled back to the elbow, and on her forearm, precise and dark and unmistakable, was a tattoo. A black eagle, wings half extended, coiled around a broken compass. And centered in the compass, where a magnetic north should have been a symbol that anyone who had been briefed at a certain classification level would know on sight. That had been specifically and carefully designed to be identifiable only to people who were cleared to know what it identified. Admiral Richard Caldwell had been briefed at that level. Once 8 years ago in a room in the Pentagon that wasn't on any public floor plan. He had hoped never to be in a situation where that briefing was relevant. He was wrong. His hand dropped away from her sleeve. Commander Voss, he said. His voice was different now. What is your full service record designation? She looked at him steadily. And she answered the question, and he stood in the doorway of the intelligence suite with the USS Resolute moving beneath him, and he understood with the specific nauseating clarity of a man who has made an irreversible mistake at the worst possible moment exactly what he had done. He had spent the last 48 hours trying to find a reason to dismiss her. He had just discovered that she had more reason to dismiss him. The silence after Elena spoke lasted exactly 4 seconds. Caldwell counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind is stalling, because it needs time to recalibrate and won't admit that yet. Then he stepped back into the room and closed the door behind him. That single action changed everything. A moment ago he had been leaving. Now he was staying, and both of them understood what that meant. He didn't sit. He stood near the door with his arms at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something stripped of its professional coating, uncertain and tight, and working hard not to show it. "How long have you been read into the program?" he asked. "Since I was 23, Elena said. 6 years. And your current assignment here? Is this active or monitoring?" she said. "Ongoing, standard." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it the way she watched all things without interpretation, just observation. His breathing had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone across the room would have noticed. But she was not across the room. "The cascade failure," he said. "Yes. You already knew what it was when you walked in that morning." "I had a strong hypothesis," she said. "I needed the real-time data to confirm it." "And the report you filed 2 days ago contains the confirmation." He moved to the chair across from her terminal and sat down in it without asking. Under any other circumstances, that would have been a dominance gesture, a senior officer claiming space in a junior officer's workspace to remind them of the hierarchy. Right now it looked like what it actually was, a man who needed to sit down. "Walk me through it," he said. "The full assessment, not the summary, everything." She looked at him for a moment, not hesitating, just measuring. Then she turned back to her terminal, pulled up the file, and began. She talked for 22 minutes without stopping. She laid out the original anomaly she had flagged at 0310, the 7 prior data points that formed the signature pattern, the cross-references to the Coronado incident and the Baltic Theater event, the specific characteristics of the cascade failure that separated it from random malfunction, and the 3 most probable mechanisms by which someone with detailed knowledge of the Resolute's backup architecture could have engineered it from outside the system. She talked about timing and access and the very specific kind of expertise required to make a deliberate failure look like an accident to every automated diagnostic tool the Navy used. She did not soften any of it. She did not pause to ask if he was following. She delivered it the way she delivered everything, completely and without performance. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "You're saying someone penetrated our systems deliberately," Caldwell said. "From outside." "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with that. I'm also saying that the mechanism they used required either external penetration or internal access." He heard what she didn't say. "Or both," he said. "Or both," she confirmed. He stood up, turned away from her, walked to the far side of the room, and stood there with his back to her for long enough that she wondered if he was collecting himself or building towards something. When he turned around, his expression had reorganized itself back into something more recognizable, the controlled command face, the Admiral in the room face. But underneath it, she could still see the shape of what he'd looked like sitting in that chair. "This assessment goes nowhere else until I say so," he said. She held very still. "Sir, I need to verify your analysis independently before this gets escalated. If this goes up the chain wrong, if it goes up half-assembled, or if the sourcing is questioned, it will get buried, and we will not get a second shot at it. You understand that?" "I understand the risk of premature escalation," she said. "I'd also note that Captain Whitaker is already aware of the broad parameters of my concern. He asked me to copy him on any findings." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Whitaker?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "When did you brief Whitaker?" 3 days ago. He came to me. He'd been pulling the routing history on my vulnerability submissions and noticed a pattern in how they were being processed. Something moved through Caldwell's face that she couldn't quite name. It was gone before she had a chance to catalog it. Fine, he said. Lupin Whitaker. No one else. This stays in this room, and his until I say otherwise. Are we clear? Clear, she said. He moved to the door. Stopped with his hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. Voss. Sir? The thing I said this morning. About your place. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he opened the door and walked out, and she listened to his footsteps diminishing down the corridor until she couldn't hear them anymore. She sat with the silence for a moment. Then she opened a new document and began writing a second separate record of the morning's conversation, time-stamped, detailed, and copied to a secure off-site archive that had nothing to do with the Resolute's primary systems. She did it not because she distrusted Caldwell specifically. She did it because she was thorough, and because Whitaker's quiet warning 3 days ago had landed where it was meant to land, and because she had learned a long time ago that in situations like this one, the person who controlled the documentation controlled the narrative. She intended to control the documentation. By 1100 that morning, Whitaker had read her full assessment. By 11:30, he had pulled 4 additional routing records that she hadn't yet accessed and found something she hadn't found. One of her 8 vulnerability reports had not been received by the automated processing system. It had been received by a human being, rerouted manually, and then re-entered into the system 7 hours later in a slightly altered form. The alteration was minor. A single classification tag changed from priority review to routine assessment. But the effect of that change was significant. It had moved her report from a 14-day review cycle to a 90-day one. Whitaker told her this in his office with the door shut, and the kind of evenness in his voice that only came from someone working very hard to maintain it. Someone changed the tag manually, Elena said. Yes. Do you know who? I know whose credentials were used. Whether those credentials were used by their owner is a separate question. She understood the distinction. Who? He told her. She sat with that for a moment. That's 2 levels above my submission pathway, she said. Yes. That's not a clerical error. No, Whitaker said. It is not. The name he had given her sat in the room between them like something neither of them wanted to touch directly, because the name was not anonymous. The name was someone she had seen in briefings, someone who had been on the Resolute for the same 6 months. She had someone who had on at least 2 occasions asked her specific questions about her analysis methodology that she had answered without thinking twice because they were framed as collegial interest. She thought about those conversations now and felt something cold move through her that she did not permit to show on her face. I need access to his communication logs, she said. You need a warrant for that, or someone with the clearance and the authority to pull them without one. Does Caldwell have that authority? Whitaker looked at her steadily. In a declared operational emergency, yes. And is this an operational emergency? That, Whitaker said, depends on what Caldwell decides it is. She nodded slowly. She understood what he was telling her. The next move was Caldwell's, and Caldwell's move would depend entirely on whether the thing she had seen sitting in that chair an hour ago was the real version of the man or just a temporary disruption of the version he preferred to be. She found out at 1400 when Caldwell called a private meeting with her and Whitaker in the flag briefing room. He had spent 3 hours apparently reviewing her assessment himself, pulling independent data and running his own cross-reference against the Coronado records. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't delegated it. He had done it alone, which told her something. He was sitting at the table when they arrived. He had a printed copy of her assessment in front of him with handwritten notations in the margins. 3 different colored pens. She counted them without meaning to. I've reviewed the analysis, he said. I've also reviewed the routing anomaly Captain Whitaker identified. He looked at her. You said you felt you were being watched. Not in those words. You said the questions you received about your methodology felt like something other than collegial interest. She had not said this in any document. She had said it to Whitaker privately 40 minutes ago. She looked at Whitaker. He said simply, I thought he needed the full picture. She looked back at Caldwell. That's accurate. In retrospect. In retrospect, Caldwell repeated. Which means at the time you dismissed it. At the time I had no data to support treating it as significant. And now you do. Now I have a routing anomaly, a failure signature that required insider knowledge to replicate, and a pattern of interest in my methodology from someone with the access level to have altered my submission. She paused. That's not a conclusion, but it's enough to open a formal inquiry. Caldwell leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He looked like a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. A formal inquiry means NCIS involvement, he said. Yes, sir. It means this ship goes under a microscope. Yes, sir. It means that everything that happened 4 days ago, including my conduct in the operations center, becomes part of a formal record. The room went very still. She understood now precisely why he had called this meeting privately, why there were no other officers present, why he had printed her assessment rather than pulling it on a screen. Yes, sir, she said. It does. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. You know what I said to you this morning? He said. It wasn't a question. I know what you said, sir. And you know what I said to you in the operations center 4 days ago. I know that too. And you filed a report. I file everything, she said. It's not personal. He almost laughed. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it got close. No, he said. I imagine it isn't. He picked up the printed assessment and looked at it. If I open a formal inquiry, NCIS will see everything, including your reports, including the routing anomaly, including the conduct of every officer on this vessel. Including yours, she said. Including mine. Yes, sir. He set the assessment down. He looked at Whitaker. Whitaker was looking at the table in the way of a man who has already made peace with what's coming and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. Get me a secure line to Pacific Fleet Command, Caldwell said. Whitaker nodded and stood. And James. It was the first time Elena had heard him use Whitaker's first name. Whitaker paused. Get NCIS on the line too. Direct. Something passed between the two older men, some long service communication that happened below the level of words. Whitaker nodded once and left the room. Caldwell and Elena were alone. He looked at her assessment again. He turned to a page near the middle, the one where she had laid out the probable mechanism for the failure, the technical architecture of it, the specific knowledge required. He tapped one line with his index finger. This section, he said. You wrote that the mechanism required someone who understood not just the system design, but the specific idiosyncrasies of how this ship's crew responds to cascade events, the response patterns, the decision trees. Yes, sir. That's not in any manual. No, sir, it's observational. It would come from being present. From watching. Yes. He tapped the line again. How long would someone need to be present to develop that level of observational data? For a crew of this experience level and consistency? She considered. 4 to 6 months. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her and she looked at him, and the shape of the thing they were both understanding sat between them. 6 months. The same length of time she had been aboard the Resolute. The same length of time the person whose name Whitaker had given her had been aboard. He came in the same rotation as you, Caldwell said. Yes, sir. And he asked about your methodology. Twice that I recall. Possibly more that I don't. Why would he ask you? She held his gaze. Because if someone is engineering a failure, and they know that a Phoenix Sentinel analyst is aboard, the most useful thing they can do is understand how that analyst thinks. What she'll look for first. What she'll dismiss as noise, and what she'll flag as signal. She paused. If you know how the person hunting you hunts, you can stay ahead of them. Caldwell's expression did something complicated. Except he didn't stay ahead of you. No, she said. He didn't. Because you filed everything. Yes. He stood up. He didn't know about the March report. He altered it. He knew it existed. He altered the classification tag. He didn't read it. If he'd read it, he would have known you'd already identified the vulnerability. He would have changed his approach. He was thinking out loud now. She could hear it, the rhythm of a tactical mind working through implications. He thought he buried it. He thought he moved it 90 days into the future. He thought he had a window. But you'd already documented the core finding in January and February, in assessments that went through a different submission pathway. He only had access to one of the 3 routing chains. Caldwell stopped moving. He stood very still. He only knew about one of your submission pathways. Yes. How many do you use? She looked at him steadily. As many as necessary, she said. He stared at her. The realization moved across his face in layers, not just what she was telling him about the situation, but what she was telling him about herself. That the calm, the quietness, the immaculate documentation, and the unshakable steadiness were not the characteristics of someone who had simply been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. They were the output of someone who had been running a parallel operation from the moment she stepped aboard this vessel. Someone who had identified a threat, maintained operational security around her response to it, used every tool available to her without advertising any of them, and who was now sitting across from him, having apparently anticipated that this conversation would eventually happen. "You've been running this since you came aboard," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "The cascade failure," he said slowly. "You didn't predict it. You were monitoring for it." "I was monitoring for evidence of the thing that would produce it, yes. Because you already knew someone was here." "I had indicators," she said. "Enough to watch, not enough to report without appearing to be chasing shadows." "So you waited." "I collected," she said. "There's a difference." He sat back down in the chair heavily. "And now you have enough." "Now I have enough. And the only reason you're telling me now is because I tore your sleeve and saw the tattoo, and you had to decide whether to run the rest of this alone or bring me in." She looked at him for a moment. "The only reason I'm telling you now," she said carefully, "is because Captain Whitaker identified the routing anomaly and determined that you needed the full picture, which is the same conclusion I reached independently about 40 minutes before he walked into your office." Caldwell absorbed this. "You were going to bring me in anyway?" "I was going to brief you this afternoon regardless of what happened this morning." "Why?" "Because you're the commanding officer of this vessel, and this is an active threat to this vessel, and whatever I think of how you handled the operations center 4 days ago, you have the authority and the obligation to be informed." She paused. "And because I needed the authority to pull the communication logs." He almost laughed again, and this time it got further. "Right," he said. "Of course." He reached for the phone on the table. Then he stopped. He put his hand back down. He looked at her, and he said, not in the Admiral voice, but in the other one, the one she'd heard briefly in the intelligence suite that morning. "I need you to understand something." She waited. "What I said to you, this morning and 4 days ago." He seemed to be searching for language, which was not something she imagined he did often. "I am aware of what I said. I am aware of what it looked like, and what it communicated, and what effect it had in the room. I am not unaware of those things." "All right," she said. "I'm not asking for—" He stopped. "I'm not asking anything. I just want you to know that I am aware." She looked at him steadily. "Awareness is a starting point," she said. "It's not nothing." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and started making calls, and the machinery of a formal military investigation began to turn slow and enormous and inevitable, like something that had been waiting for permission. Outside in the corridor, a junior officer named Webb was walking past with a stack of reports when he heard the Admiral's voice through the closed briefing room door, low and serious and careful, in a way it hadn't been 4 days ago. He slowed down without quite stopping. He couldn't make out words. Just the tone. Just the register of a man having a conversation that was costing him something. Webb kept walking. He filed that away too. Because he had been paying attention since the moment Elena Voss's hands hadn't shaken, and the picture assembling itself in the back of his mind was beginning to look like something very specific. He just didn't have a name for it yet. By 1800 that evening, NCIS had 2 agents aboard the Resolute. By 1900, the communication logs for the officer Whitaker had named had been formally seized. By 2100, Elena was sitting in a room with 2 NCIS investigators going through her documentation line by line, and the investigators were asking very careful questions in the particular way of people who already know the answers and are verifying their knowledge against a primary source. She answered everything. She answered completely in sequence with timestamps and cross-references because she had maintained the documentation exactly for this purpose. Because documentation was not just her professional habit, it was her operational armor. Every report filed, every transmission logged, every communication time-stamped. Not because she was meticulous in a passive sense, because she had understood from the day she stepped aboard this ship that if she was right about what was happening here, the moment of reckoning would come down to whose record was cleaner. Her record was immaculate. At 2145, one of the investigators, a woman named Special Agent Carrillo, who had the efficient affect of someone who had spent 15 years not being surprised by anything, looked up from the documentation and said simply, "You built this case across 6 months without alerting the subject." "Yes." "While performing your primary assignment duties at full capacity?" "Yes." "And the vulnerability reports you submitted, were those part of the case building or separate?" "Both," Elena said. "The vulnerabilities I identified were real and needed to be reported regardless. But the reporting also created a documented record of my analytical timeline that would be useful if the case went to formal review." Carrillo looked at her for a long moment. "You were creating a paper trail that would prove your timeline preceded the events." "I was documenting my work," Elena said. "I always document my work." Carrillo wrote something in her notes. "One more question, Commander, and this is informal off the record." Elena waited. "Did you ever consider," Carrillo said, "that this would have been a lot simpler if you'd just told someone what you were doing 6 months ago?" Elena thought about the March report sitting in a 90-day review queue. She thought about the January and February assessments acknowledged and unread. She thought about the Admiral in the operations center, telling her to know her place, and the years before that, and all the rooms full of people who had heard what she said, and then looked to the person standing next to her for confirmation. "Yes," she said. "I considered it. And I documented everything instead." Carrillo held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she wrote something else in her notes, and Elena did not ask what it was. She already knew what it was. Because she had been in enough rooms with enough investigators to know that when they stopped asking questions and started writing, it meant they had what they needed. And what they needed was what she had given them. All of it. Every last documented piece. Outside the room, somewhere deeper in the ship, Admiral Richard Caldwell was having a very different kind of conversation. One that was not going well for him. One that he had walked into with his eyes open because he had made the call himself and he understood what the call meant. He was a man in the middle of the longest night of his career, and he was handling it in the way that he handled things when the performance layer was no longer sustainable quietly, and with more honesty than anyone who knew his public reputation would have expected from him. Elena didn't know any of that yet. She would know it later, and it would matter to her in a way she wouldn't have predicted, but right now she had work to do. She turned back to the investigators, and she kept talking, and the record kept growing. And somewhere in a secured section of the ship's communication archive, a thread of evidence was sitting exactly where she had always known it would be, waiting for exactly the right person, with exactly the right authority to pull it. She had made sure of that. She had made sure of everything. The NCIS investigation moved fast once it had traction, the way these things always do when the documentation is clean and the evidence doesn't require interpretation. Within 48 hours of Caldwell's call to Pacific Fleet Command, 3 additional agents had joined Carrillo aboard the Resolute. Within 72 hours, the officer whose credentials had been used to reroute Elena's March submission had been formally placed on restricted duty pending inquiry. His name was Commander David Harlan, and he had spent 6 months on this ship asking the right questions in all the wrong ways, and he had been good enough at it that no one had noticed until Elena had. Harlan didn't deny the routing change when confronted. He said it was a clerical error. He said it calmly with the practiced steadiness of someone who had rehearsed the answer. Carrillo had listened to him say it, and then placed Elena's full documentation package on the table between them and let him look at it without speaking, and after approximately 90 seconds of silence, Harlan had asked for a lawyer. That was how Elena heard it secondhand from Whitaker, who had heard it from Carrillo. She received the information, noted it, and went back to her terminal. Because Harlan asking for a lawyer was not the end. It was the beginning of a different problem, the kind of problem that started when the person caught doing the thing denied the thing, and suddenly everyone who had ever been in the same room as him needed to decide which version of events they were going to stand behind. That problem hadn't fully developed yet, but she could see it coming the way she could see most things coming by watching the data and understanding what the pattern meant. What the pattern meant in this case was that a formal review board was being convened, not just for Harlan, but for the incident as a whole. The cascade failure, the intelligence lapses, the vulnerability reports that had been processed incorrectly, the conduct of the ship's command during the crisis. All of it assembled into a single formal proceeding that would determine what happened next to everyone involved, including Admiral Caldwell, including Elena. Whitaker told her about the review board on a Thursday morning. She had slept 4 hours. She was on her second cup of coffee, and she was reviewing a separate set of data that had nothing to do with Harlan, because the threat posture of the fleet did not pause for internal investigations, and someone had to keep watching the horizon. "The board convenes Monday," Whitaker said. "In San Diego. We'll be transported off the ship Friday evening. All of us. The principals. You meet Caldwell Harlan's legal team. The NCIS leads." He paused. "There are also going to be observers." She looked up from her terminal. "What kind of observers?" "The kind," he said carefully, "that suggests this has moved beyond a ship-level incident." She understood. "Pentagon. At minimum." She set down her coffee cup. "Who requested the observers?" "That I don't know yet. What I do know is that someone at a level above Pacific Fleet Command has decided this review is going to be thorough." He paused. "That's either very good news or very complicated news, depending on what they're actually there to observe." She thought about that. If they're there because of the security breach, it's good news. If they're there because of something else, then we'll find out Monday, Whitaker said. "Either way, you need to be ready." "I'm always ready," she said. He almost smiled. "I know. That's not what I mean." He looked at her directly. "I mean that this is going to be a room full of very senior people who are going to look at everything you did over the past 6 months and form opinions about it. Some of those opinions will be informed by the documentation. Some of them will be informed by other things. Like what I look like," she said. "Like how old you are. Like how long you've been in. Like the fact that the most senior officer on the ship publicly questioned your competence in front of the operations crew 4 days before a formal inquiry was opened into a security breach you identified." He paused. "There are going to be people in that room who look at all of that and reach conclusions that have nothing to do with the evidence." She looked at him for a long moment. "Captain Whitaker, have I ever adjusted my approach based on what I expected other people to conclude about me?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "you haven't." "Then Monday won't be different," she said, and she turned back to her terminal, and he left her to it. She spent Thursday and Friday doing 2 things simultaneously. She continued monitoring the fleet's threat posture, because that was her job, and she did her job. And she prepared for Monday, organizing her documentation into the most cogent possible sequence, reviewing her own analysis for any gap or overreach, any place where she had moved from documented fact to reasonable inference without marking the transition clearly. She found 2 such places and flagged them explicitly, adding notation to clarify where the certainty ended and the probability assessment began. She did not consult with anyone on the preparation. She did not ask Whitaker to review it. She did not request legal representation because she was not accused of anything, and requesting representation when not accused tended to create the impression that you expected to be, which created the impression that you should be. She worked alone, which was the way she always worked best. Webb found her Friday afternoon in the corridor outside the intelligence suite, carrying a transit bag that held everything she would need for 3 days in San Diego. He was off duty technically, and he had the slightly awkward posture of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity and wasn't entirely sure what to do now that it had arrived. "Commander Voss," he said. She stopped. "Webb." He opened his mouth closed. It tried again. "I want to say something," he said. "Before you leave." She waited. "4 days ago," he said. "When the Admiral said what he said to you, in the operations center, I was standing 12 feet away and I didn't say anything." She looked at him steadily. He was 27, she estimated. He had the face of someone who had been thinking about this for 4 days and had decided that not saying it was worse than the alternative. "I know," she said. "I should have said something." "What would you have said?" He hesitated. "That you were right. That your analysis was right. That watching you work those 45 minutes before the Admiral came in was—" He stopped. "I've been in this service for 4 years. I've never seen anyone work a problem the way you worked that problem." She considered him for a moment. "Webb, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I don't know if I'll get another chance. And because—" He looked at the floor, then back at her. "Because I think what's going to happen Monday is going to be harder than it should be, and I think you probably know that, and I just wanted someone to say out loud that I know what I saw." She was quiet for a moment. She felt the weight of what he was offering, not advocacy, not testimony. Just the simple human acknowledgement that someone had been watching and had seen accurately. She understood how rare that was. She had spent 6 years understanding how rare that was. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. She rarely used first names. He seemed to understand that it meant something. "If they ask you what you observed in the operations center, you tell them exactly what you told me just now. That's all." "Will it matter?" "Truth usually does," she said. "Eventually." She went to San Diego. The review board convened Monday morning in a secure conference facility at Naval Station San Diego. The room held 17 people when Elena walked in. She had been told to expect 12. She counted the additional 5 and recognized 3 of them immediately, not by name, but by the particular quality of stillness that came from operating at a certain level for a long time. These were people who had learned to watch, without appearing to watch, to listen, without appearing to listen. They sat along one side of the room with the slightly separate quality of observers who were not yet ready to be identified as participants. The board chair was Vice Admiral Sandra Morse, 61, with close-cropped gray hair and an expression of calibrated neutrality that Elena recognized as a professional skill requiring decades to perfect. Morse had the reputation of someone who had reached her rank by being consistently right in the most inconvenient ways possible, which was a reputation Elena respected. She also recognized, seated to Morse's left, a retired Master Chief Petty Officer named Daniel Reyes. She did not show that she recognized him. She sat down at the designated chair, placed her documentation portfolio on the table in front of her, and looked at the board without particular expression. Reyes did not look at her at all. Not yet. The proceedings opened with Morse reading the formal scope of the review, which covered the Cascade failure event, the intelligence submission processing anomalies, the security breach, investigation findings to date, and the conduct of personnel during and subsequent to the crisis. Formal language, procedural and exact. Elena listened to all of it and noted the sequence because sequence in a proceeding like this was never accidental. Caldwell came first. He sat at the witness position with the particular posture of a man who had decided in advance to cooperate fully and was discovering that the decision, while correct, was not comfortable. Morse asked him to walk through the events of the morning of the Cascade failure. He did. He was accurate. He did not minimize his own conduct or Elena's role, which surprised some people in the room based on the quality of their silence. He described his comment in the operations center. He described the morning interaction in the intelligence suite. He described the torn sleeve. His voice was steady throughout, and his account matched Elena's documentation precisely at every point. When he finished, Morse looked at him for a moment. "Admiral Caldwell, in your assessment, did Commander Voss perform her duties appropriately during the events in question?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Did she demonstrate competence under pressure?" "She demonstrated," he said slowly, "a level of competence that I did not initially recognize because of the form it took. She was calm when I expected urgency. She was precise when I expected action. I misread those qualities as inaction." He paused. I was wrong. Morse wrote something. Was her warning report received and appropriately processed? No, he said. It was not. Was that failure attributable to Commander Voss? No, he said. It was not. He was excused. He walked past Elena on his way back to the observation seating, and he did not look at her, but his pace changed slightly as he passed her chair, almost imperceptibly slower, and she understood it as the closest thing to acknowledgement that the situation permitted him. Then it was her turn. She walked to the witness position and sat down and looked at Vice Admiral Morse. And Morse looked back at her with those calibrated neutral eyes, and the room got the particular quality of silence that meant everyone in it understood that something important was about to happen. Commander Voss, Morse said, I'd like to begin with your Phoenix Sentinel designation. Specifically, I'd like you to describe for this board the nature of your assignment aboard the USS Resolute. The additional observers along the side of the room had not moved, but the quality of their stillness changed. My primary assignment aboard the Resolute, Elena said, was Naval Intelligence Tactical Analysis. That is the assignment documented in my personnel file and known to the ship's command. And your secondary assignment? My secondary assignment, Elena said, operated under a separate authorization chain and was not disclosed to the ship's command. A beat. Can you describe the nature of that secondary assignment? I can describe it in general terms appropriate to this classification level, Elena said. I was tasked with monitoring for indicators of internal compromise within the assigned command structure, specifically patterns consistent with an embedded intelligence threat, using access to U.S. naval systems for either intelligence gathering or operational disruption. The room was completely silent. You were placed aboard this ship, Morse said, as a counterintelligence monitor. Yes, ma'am. And in that capacity over the 6 months of your assignment, you identified an active threat. I identified indicators consistent with an active threat, Elena said. The formal conclusion is NCIS's to make based on the full evidence package. But you built that evidence package. Yes, ma'am. While simultaneously performing your cover assignment at full capacity. Yes, ma'am. And while doing so, you submitted 8 vulnerability assessments through the standard reporting chain. Yes, ma'am. One of which was tampered with by the subject of your counterintelligence operation. Yes, ma'am. Morse looked at her for a long moment. Commander, I want to ask you something directly. The morning of the Cascade failure. When Admiral Caldwell made his comment in the operations center, when he grabbed your sleeve and tore it. You were at that moment 6 months into a covert counterintelligence assignment that you had not disclosed to him. You had identified him as not the subject of your investigation, but as someone whose awareness of your actual role could have compromised it. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am. So in the moment when he publicly questioned your competence, you were in possession of information that would have immediately and completely reversed the dynamic of that interaction. Yes, ma'am. And you said nothing. No, ma'am. Why? Elena considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer deserved to be said accurately. Because using my designation to defend myself in a personal confrontation would have been a misuse of a classification that exists for operational purposes, she said. And because the confrontation, however uncomfortable, was not the mission. The mission was the operation. I don't compromise operational security because someone says something that stings. Morse held her gaze for a long moment. Does it sting? She asked. And there was something in the question that was not quite official, something human and direct that cut through the procedural language. Elena looked at her steadily. Yes, ma'am, she said. It does. That answer landed in the room differently than the others had. Because it